Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.
Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. We are wrapping up the last full week for the month of June, and Mother Nature is certainly reminding us of the season with the hot temperatures we've seen. We hope you're staying cool as you join us for today's program. On the topic of heat, you've likely seen the news stories regarding those losses of cattle in the southwestern portion of the state of Kansas. The issue at hand were temperatures over 100 degrees, high humidity, and there was little to no wind to help cool those animals. With more days like that likely ahead, we wanted to share with you some tips that we've been given for caring for cattle during those hot summer days. Market Journal's Bill Dodd brings us this story.
The dog days of summer are officially upon us. As temperatures climbed to a stifling degree this month, cattle had a very small window of opportunity to acclimate to summer weather conditions. That means helping your cattle cope with the increasingly hot days of summer will be paramount to your operation. One of the best ways to help your cattle beat the heat is to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to heat-related events.
Yes, so when it comes to heat stress with cattle, once a heat event has occurred, I don't want to say it's too late, but it's a lot more challenging to implement strategies to help them cope in those situations. And so it is really important to kind of plan ahead and look for some of those heat events that are approaching so you can be proactive in helping them adjust to those temperatures.
Cattle simply can't handle the stress of hot summer days as well as we humans are capable. One very important factor producers should be well aware of is the thermal neutral zone. As temperatures go beyond this upper critical threshold, you may see telltale signs that the heat is beginning to stress some animals.
So the thermoneutral zone is basically that range in temperature when cattle don't need to use any extra energy to help maintain their body temperature. And so for cattle, this is about 32 to 75 degrees. And so when we see temperatures getting above that range, they'll use additional energy to get rid of that heat. And so if you see cattle panting, or if they have increased heart rate or respiration rates, these are all signs that they're likely experiencing heat stress.
Keeping your cattle healthy and comfortable during extreme heat can be a bit of a challenge, but failure to do so could have dire consequences for the animal as well as your bottom line. Beyond the more typical heat-related symptoms, you should monitor feed intake as well. Once the heat has started to impact cattle, they may tend to eat less in order to try and cope with these higher temperatures.
So typically we'll see them go off feed if they're really experiencing heat stress, which ultimately is going to result in less gain. But cattle that are severely stressed, they could die. So we could lose some cattle in extreme cases.
I've always heard the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And it seems the same can be said when it comes to cattle in hot summer days. The bigger they are, the hotter they get. When it comes to keeping an eye on your cattle in these temperatures, you should be particularly mindful of cattle that may be on the upper end of their body condition score, as they may be more susceptible to heat stress than their counterparts with a lower BCS.
Typically, the cattle we see that probably experience the most heat stress would be our fat cattle. So the heavier they get, the harder it is for them to dissipate heat. Typically, the healthy body condition score for when we're talking for our cows, and that would be around that condition score 5. So we want to see them there in average.
When it comes to heat stress mitigation, there are a number of strategies you could implement. As we stated earlier, staying proactive and frequently monitoring weather reports of prolonged temperatures in the 80s and 90s would serve you well. Furthermore, you may want to avoid working or transporting cattle any earlier than 10 in the morning if possible. However, it's always important to stick to the basics. Plenty to drink and a nice breeze can go a long way.
So the most important thing, and I know it seems like the obvious one, would be making sure they have plenty of fresh water. And because they're going to drink more when it's hot out, and actually they're going to drink about twice as much as they normally would, which can be up to 30 gallons a day. And so sometimes if you just need to put out extra waters or put some water in the bunks, just making sure they have plenty of fresh water. The other thing is wind. Wind is definitely your friend when it comes to heat stress. And so if you can get those cattle away from any wind breaks, or also if you have extra pens available that you could put some of those cattle in just to help them get more exposed to the air movement.
Usually on these hot summer days, when people get hot, we have the luxury of hopping in a shower and cooling off. While sprinklers can be an effective tool for cooling down cattle that are burdened with these high temperatures, there are certainly a couple of considerations to keep in mind before giving your cattle a shower to cool off.
Yeah, so sprinklers can certainly be a good tool. You want to make sure that it has a large droplet size, and you also want to be aware of the humidity level because if it's high humidity, the use of sprinklers is just going to make the problem worse.
If the temperatures we've experienced in June are any indication of what we have to look forward to for the remainder of the summer, we could be in for a scorcher. If that's the case, this won't be a summer of fun in the sun for you and your herd. However, following these tips could make the dog days of summer much easier on your cattle. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
If you would like to learn more about how you can help your cattle deal with the stress of summer heat, you can always visit the website beef.unl.edu. We've also posted a helpful article along with this story to the Market Journal website. Up next, if you've happened to notice some corn plant injury over the past few weeks, you may want to be on the lookout for Stalk Borer in your fields. This pest typically feeds on leaves and then will tunnel into stalks. Eventually, this loss could lead to yield loss. Market Journal's Mike Straub recently caught up with Extension entomologist Bob Wright to get some of his tips on mitigation strategies.
With corn going strong, it is time to start scouting for Stalk Borer. These pests can be found in any part of the state. However, eastern Nebraska is at greater risk.
The stalk borer can be found statewide. It's probably historically been more of a problem in the eastern part of the state, but it could be anywhere.
With an unusual life cycle, stalk borer tend to lay eggs over the winter. They begin their life cycle on the border of the fields and move into the fields as they get bigger.
They typically lay eggs on the field border, particularly like if you have a brome grass border or grass borders along the terraces or something. That's where they'll lay eggs. They'll lay the eggs over winter, and they've been hatching for a while now. The thing that's sort of unusual, they feed mostly in grasses, but they can feed on a wide variety of the other plants as well. The thing that's unusual, as they hatch out in the spring, typically the caterpillars will start feeding in brome grass or some other border grass. And as the caterpillar gets too big to stay inside that smaller plant, it starts moving around to find a better host. And that's when it can infest corn and other crops. And so we have enough degree days now that it's at least in southeast Nebraska, it's getting to the point where it might start entering into cornfields. And so we want people to scout and look for injury. And if this high enough on the field borders, typically, it may be time to treat.
Stalk borer feed at the base of a plant. When scouting, you should be looking for stunted plants or plants with dead growing points.
Okay, typically, the thing to look for would be on field borders. If there's stunted plants or plants with a dead growing point or defoliation to the leaf, the caterpillar feeds in the base of the plant typically. Sometimes they can burrow down into the whorl, but they'll damage the growing point of the plant or the leaves as they come out. So if you see some of those symptoms on the edge of the field, you can try to pull out the whorl or dissect the plant.
Depending on the growth stage of a crop, having stalk borer could cause yield loss, especially in younger plants.
So typically we see yield loss with an infestation, mostly on field borders. They can kill plants depends on the growth stage of the corn that they attack. Younger plants are more likely to be damaged more severely. And so one management practice, if you're in an area that has a lot of stalk borer in the future, early planting can help so that the plants are bigger at the time the larvae are moving and they're less likely to cause economic damage. And we have economic thresholds in terms of whether or not it's going to pay to treat, and that varies with crop growth stage as well as the number of caterpillars. And so again, if with smaller plants, they're likely to have economic damage. So later planted fields would be more at risk than earlier planted fields.
Stalk borer isn't as much of a widespread problem as other soil insects such as corn rootworm. It is a good idea that you be scouting for them this time of year, especially if you've had stalk borer in the past or have fields with grassy borders.
Well, this isn't typically a real widespread pest like corn rootworm or some of the other major corn pests, but in areas, particularly if you have fields with either grassy borders or have a history of common stalk borer, it's something to scout for at this time of the year. And you may be able to get by with just a border treatment because they're most likely going to be heaviest in the border. The current BTs don't have much activity. BT corns don't have much activity against common stalk borer, so that's not a helpful management option. But foliar insecticides, when needed, can be very effective in reducing injury. Thing I'd point out also is that because the degree days accumulate at different rates in different parts of the state, right now in southeast Nebraska is when you really should be out checking field borders. And in the next couple of weeks, that's going to occur other parts of the state as we go further west and north. Degree days accumulate a little later. And there's degree day data available through the Nebraska State Climate Office, and again we link to that in our Crop Watch article, so you can look up the current degree day information and what you should be doing based on the degree day accumulations in your area.
If you think you might have a stalk borer infestation, stunted plants and dead growing points are two good indications. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
Thanks for that story, Mike. Bob also tells us that stalk borers attack more than 100 other species of plants, which includes soybeans. However, the stalk borer is not typically an economically threatening pest for that crop. If you'd like more information on this topic, the website to learn more is cropwatch.unl.edu. As we turn our attention over to the grain markets now, it was a short trading week with the markets closed on Monday for the Juneteenth holiday. We were joined earlier in the week by Darin Fessler of Lakefront Futures and Options. I began the discussion by asking Darin about his general take on the sentiment in the market. Well, let's start here. What's your big picture sentiment on these markets right now?
Well, the big picture is, what does the outside markets do? I think there's so many correlations with 2008 right now. I don't think that they can be ignored. I think there's a lot of issues out there with crops. Obviously, it's not just Nebraska. It's the Dakotas. It's the Minnesota. It's still late parts of June. We got July. We got August. There's a lot of things that could still happen to this crop, but what does the outside markets do? We've had a lot of equity pressure. You see crude oil this week starting to really kind of maybe roll over there. RBOB's following suit. So crude oil was really led this commodity rally. And so if crude oil goes, I've still been in the camp that, hey, commodities could follow suit with which way our crude goes. If crude remains strong, I think the corn, bean, wheat market does remain somewhat elevated.
So I've heard lots that it's an outside market here driving the commodities, but also it's the weather market right now. Talk about the weather side of this equation.
Yeah, the weather obviously in Nebraska has not been friendly at all. And I think if producers looking at these weekly good, excellent ratings, I would take some of it with a little bit of grain of salt right now. Those will not move the market in this environment, I don't think. I think this is much more fun related. This is much more a macro issue that we're dealing with right now. And when you start to see technical pressure that we've seen in this market, corn, beans, especially wheat, it is a momentum trade. You got retail buyer or retail traders come in here. You have funds starting to sell it, liquidate positions ahead of what typically is a seasonal bearish tendency. And then you have the rollover in crude, which is obviously having an impact on all of this stuff. But we're getting very, very close to some of these 100-day moving averages that must hold for the bulls here. Again, we have a lot of growing season left here, so I'm not going to count out the bulls just yet.
Well, it's been an interesting trading week. We had Monday, the markets closed, and just a couple days here on the books as you and I have this conversation. Not a lot of strength, though, in the markets. I guess we saw a rough day to start the week, at least.
Yeah, and I think it started last Friday. You get to that that 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Central, you know, you look at those candles there on the charts, and we really saw some breakdowns. When I see bearish crossover, meaning like the 5 and the 9-day moving averages cross over to the 20s and the 50s, that's just an indication of momentum is shifting, the trend is shifting. And when we opened up Monday night, we really needed to see some strength, because we were hot, we were dry most of last week. We, you know, cut off a 3-day weekend. You would think that we would see some support in those markets. And even on the Tuesdays when we got those crop ratings, they came in less than what the trade estimates were, and we still didn't see strength. That's not what you want to see if you're a bull in this market.
Well, I want to get to a couple of our viewer questions because we did receive a couple this week. Daryl from Northeast Nebraska wanted to know, on the corn side of things, are the highs we posted back earlier this spring the high we might see for the whole year? Your thoughts?
That is a great question. I think it's one of two things. If the outside markets can calm down a little bit, we can start to see some consolidation, some upward mobility within the equity markets, the stock market, then I think potentially we run in some weather, I think we can make some higher highs. As of right now, I'm not going to say that. That's a certain slam dunk type of situation, but we do have a bullish balance sheet that could definitely, you know, present some very, very good opportunities if we have some weather here.
Next week is a big week, and to that point, Ben in Elwood, Nebraska had asked about, we saw the intended acreage report come out. Next week on June 30th, we'll see the planted acres report come out, USDA's estimates there. What are your thoughts on what that report could hold?
Well, I was completely wrong in the March timeframe. I thought the producer would be incentivized to go out there, plant the corn, but you know, it was more or less a risk-adverse situation because of high input costs. If I listen to some of the CEOs of some of these larger input supplying companies around the country, they're saying, you know, we didn't have a problem with sourcing seed, you know, as far as corn. You know, the farmer seemed like they've been risk adverse. So I don't think these corn acres change as much as people want to believe, especially with how late some of the Dakotas were. I think those producers up there were more inclined to plant beans, wheat, or some specialty crop. So I would say the clients that I have, if they're picking up ground, they probably were going corn. But again, I don't think these bean and corn acres move all that much.
I want to make sure I get your thoughts on basis. How are things looking out across the countryside there?
Very, very strong. I think the basis is going to remain very strong. The question is, do you hold to see what if the weather, you know, brings any type sort of issues for the production, or do we just sell it right now, play it on the board? I think those are the strategies that I think producers need to be thinking about right now. But I would definitely be taking advantage of the strong basis.
You posed the question, kind of answered that yourself, but to that point, when it comes to risk management advice, so what are you doing right now, and what are you advising to your producers?
I think you need to have flexible strategies in place. Now, granted, I like having collar position on where you're buying puts, selling calls, and keeping it flexible in this environment, just because the balance sheet says, hey, if we run into weather, there could be some pretty big fireworks yet to come here. So going out there, utilizing HTAs, maybe some reownership on the board opportunities as they present themselves are the way I'm playing it.
Final word, about 30 seconds left. What else would you like to add this week?
I think the biggest key thing here leading up to the month-end reports is, one, the quarterly stocks, the acreage are going to be the determining factor for the July-August time frame. Granted, the funds are liquidating here a little bit. That does not mean they're going to not jump back in here. If we have weather, they're going to be certainly jumping back in.
A big thanks to Darin for his time this week. Coming up next week, we'll travel out to Briggs Feed Yard there at Seward, Nebraska to catch up with Mike Briggs. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask Mike, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll be sure to pass those questions along. There was a lot going on in the unicameral this spring in Lincoln that likely will impact the agriculture industry. From tax relief packages to the water projects, the second session of the 107th Nebraska Legislature featured debates and discussions on many issues of interest for producers. Legislation that passed also dealt with rural development tax credits, a new ag innovation facility, local meat processing, resilient soils, and a boost to rural broadband. You can learn more of all the takeaways for agriculture from this past unicameral session in the June issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is once again time for our weekly weather forecast with Nebraska Extension ag climatologist and Market Journal chief meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, summer is officially here, and it certainly has felt like that outside. What are you tracking as we turn to the week ahead?
Well, Bryce, we've seen that warm weather last weekend, got a little break during the early part of the week, and then, of course, we've seen the renewed heat here the last couple of days, and, of course, we've seen an increase in thunderstorm activity. But prior to that, most of the major moisture was felt in the northern panhandle and a small portion of southwest Nebraska before we seen this warm front kind of bring this warm air up into our region. And of course, the scattered thunderstorm activity that developed from the south up to the north over the last 2 days. Now we're going to be looking at some cooler air coming in before we start to see the heat rebuild as we go into the middle of next week, and a more uncertain pattern as we go into the 4th of July weekend. So as we look at the upper air models, the first thing we'll draw your attention to is the upper air low that is moving across southern Canada, the northern plains. That's brought the cooler air into our region and will push an additional boundary through our state as we go through the afternoon hours, and that'll be the secondary cold front. We do have a low pressure at the surface sitting over northern Texas, bringing a deep set of moisture up into the central plains, and here's that cold front that'll be passing through during the day, and then we'll see a northwest flow on the back side of it, bringing that cool air in as that low goes over toward the Great Lakes. So by tomorrow, high pressure will be firmly in control over the central United States. Cool northwest flow into our region pushes the moisture down to our south, and the main heavier precipitation moves up into South Canada. Now that ridge starts to build back up as we go into Monday. We'll be in a northwest flow, so a little bit cooler conditions in the east compared to the west by about 5 degrees. We should be into the 80s in the east, upper 80s to the west, and precipitation will remain to our south and southeast. Now as we go into Tuesday, we start to see that ridge expand into our region, bringing some drier conditions and warmer temperatures. We should make the low 90s in the southwest, and we'll be looking at the mid to upper 80s across the east northeastern part of the state. We'll start to see some moisture returning to the central mountains with the tropical moisture coming in, monsoonal flow, and by Wednesday we start to see another trough coming into the Pacific Northwest that's going to try to push a cold front through the state slowly as we go through the day. Low pressure over the eastern Dakotas. Not much in the way of precipitation, but we do see still some of that monsoonal moisture. And as we get into Thursday, some of that moisture will start to move up into the central Rockies as this front starts to sag a little bit south. And we'll also have the development of a low pressure system in the western portions of Kansas that will help to keep low level moisture coming up toward the north. So we start to see the spread of that moisture into portions of the panhandle. And by Friday, we see that trough bringing the deep moisture in from the southwest. A little wave moves out of that trough. And we do expect, at least from this standpoint in the model, that we will start to see some significant moisture across portions of the state, and that may carry on into the second. There's a little bit of uncertainty there, but certainly a decent shot for some significant moisture from eastern Nebraska all the way through Iowa. If we look a little farther into the future, the Climate Prediction Center's forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday essentially keeps the warmer conditions in place, and in terms of precipitation, looks like we're going to see a pretty significant monsoonal flow into our region with several waves coming through, so we do have some additional thunderstorm chances before conditions start to turn a little bit warmer.
Thank you for that, Al. Finally today, earlier this month, we were fortunate enough to catch up with the Farm Service Agency Administrator, Zach Ducheneaux, when he made a brief stop here at the University of Nebraska. During his visit to the Cornhusker State, the FSA Administrator made a point to visiting with a few of the University of Nebraska's lead fellows. That visit yielded positive discussions on ways in which the FSA can improve its programs and services. Ducheneaux tells us he received some productive points that he'll be taking back to the nation's capital.
It's been really good. I got a chance to meet with the Nebraska lead group, some of their different graduates, some of their newer cohort, and had a really good conversation about what we can do to improve Farm Service Agency and USDA programs in the future. My goal is to see some of the impact of what we've been doing here for our producers in the last few months, to see some of the drought impact, talk to some of the producers, hear stakeholder input, and take it back to DC so that we can incorporate that into the front end of policymaking instead of as an afterthought. There is a lot of work for us all to do together on improving the way that we deliver our services. And one of the things that I shared with them is stay engaged, stay active, take that leadership role seriously, because if my generation had all of the answers, they'd be out farming today. They wouldn't be here doing this. So we need their input, we need their feedback, and Secretary Vilsack has charged us with making sure people know their feedback is valuable and it'll be incorporated.
Try to make sure you have timely.
Last September, Congress authorized the FSA to distribute $10 billion in disaster assistance in order to address a growing number of challenges. Ducheneaux shared some insight into how those disaster relief funds are helping address some producer problems here in Nebraska and all across the country.
As we thought about doing this, we wanted to build a process that was at once easier on our producers as well as easier on our county staff. But in the last 4 or 5 years, they've delivered roughly an average of a farm bill of funding in disaster and ad hoc programs every year. So it's important that we build these processes. In the ELRP, Emergency Livestock Relief Program, and the Emergency Relief Program, because ELRP was built on the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, and we realized that some producers who, for whatever reason, didn't file an LFP application that were eligible, we're encouraging them to come in and file a late application so that we can help get them that assistance for any drought impacts they might have had in 2021 for their livestock. ERP is a program that's really a novel collaboration between FSA and Risk Management Agency. We have used information from our crop insurance providers to qualify losses under eligible weather events and just send a pre-populated form out to our crop growers out there in the countryside to check that form, verify it with your crop insurance company or your agent, and bring that form in, sign it, agree to the linkage requirement for 2 years to buy available insurance products, and then we'll send you a payment. We're really proud that we rolled those out and how we've been able to meet stakeholder needs.
We certainly thank Administrator Ducheneaux for his time while he was here. Before he wrapped up our conversation, he wanted to stress to you, our viewers, how crucial it was to hear from our producers for the Farm Service Agency. If you have any feedback or questions for Zach, you're encouraged to reach out to him directly. He shared his email as well as his phone number, which we will include on the Market Journal website. That is all the time we have for this week's show. For behind-the-scenes content, longer-form interviews, and more, be sure you like and follow Market Journal on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We hope to see you back here next time. Until then, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.